Well, hello, everyone. I'm Ashley Spinelli, and I'm so happy to welcome you today to the Data First Forum, Blockbuster Breaches. So now it's time to introduce our cast. Let me start with our Varonis moderator, the star of State of Cybercrime, the best sport for making silly promo videos, and our VP of Incident Response and Cloud Operations, Matt Radolec. Say hi, Matt.
Thanks for having me, Ashley.
Joining Matt and I are our esteemed and accomplished CISO guests, Charles Garzoni, the Deputy CISO and Staff VP of Cyber Defense Operations at Centene.
Hello.
And we also have Mario DiNatale, the Chief Information Security Officer at OdysseyRe.
Hi.
So for our agenda today, we'll start with a breach breakdown. Our CISO guests are going to give us the skinny on the breaches that change us. We'll talk about some predictions about the breaches of tomorrow. We'll talk about preparing for an incident and what you can do to be ready to respond and what are the things that you should be thinking about. Then we'll end with some live Q&A. So good luck on trivia. Enjoy the session. And Matt, I'll leave things to you.
Yeah, thank you. Before I get started, I just wanted to echo one of the sentiments from one of our audience members. I think that Mario wins the coolest shirt on the webinar award. So we might want to spotlight that for just a second. But really to get us going, and you know, Mario and Charles, when we were prepping and we were talking about like what are blockbuster breaches to us, like what comes to mind, there were two that really stood out above the rest. And the one that got us talking the most was the one I wanted to get started with, which was the Uber breach. You know, everybody wants to talk about like both what happened and sort of the lessons learned from it, but also the morality aspect. And I'm curious, you know, just to get us kicked off, like what your guys' thoughts are, or really what makes the Uber breach a blockbuster breach?
Yeah, we're gonna really step into it right off the bat. I like the direction we're going into. This is gonna be controversial. LinkedIn is still on fire about this breach, either in support of Joe Sullivan or talking about you know, the ethical obligations that he was supposed to honor in his position, and also the fallout for the rest of the CISOs in the industry, right? Like there's a lot of people thinking twice about wanting to step into the role now that there's actual repercussions for doing your job either negligently or unsatisfactorily. But I think what really sticks out in my mind in regards to the Uber breach is that for the first time ever, really, we have legal discovery on a timeline of an incident response at a major company that's all published, right? So we can actually see in the public record now exactly when the CISO found out about it, when the CEO and the board found out about it, and what their responses were, because they not only did they not copy in legal, they deliberately went around legal so that these could be captured in public record. But they've been disclosed for all of us. And for those unfamiliar with, you know, the breach in general, right? Essentially, a third party gained access to a lot of PII at Uber, and then asked for payment. And Uber's response essentially was, how could they spin this in a way where they wouldn't have to report a breach and could pay out through their bug bounty program, you know, a bounty that was many multiples of what they would typically pay in a bug bounty. And I think, you know, that's like a really good point for me to kind of let Chuck or Charles jump in and kind of give some of his summation of how he saw it from, you know, from his perspective and his experience.
Yeah, no, thanks, Mario. I think that's the one question that everyone asks is, oh, okay, what should they have done? And you know, I hate Monday morning quarterbacking other folks, but you know, you can make a mistake. You can have holes in your security. You can You can have areas, obviously, of your infrastructure that aren't covered by security devices. Don't use MFA. There's a whole host of things that you can do and get away with it. And I think the one thing that you can't do is make it look in any way like you're trying to cover something up. Because at that point, it doesn't matter what the answer is, or what happened, or any flaws. I mean, honesty is, it's all fun and games until you get pulled in front of Congress, and they start because their staffers are going to give them the questions to ask, and they're going to be very hard questions, and they're not going to make you look very good either. If you try to cover anything up, everything else gets lost. What happened in the breach gets lost. It's just it implies that you're purposely trying to prevent people from knowing what happened, and in this day and age, that's impossible. People are always going to know. And there's been some things in cyber that have happened very quietly, but this definitely wasn't going to be one of those. And so if you don't come outright and say, and be at 1,000% honest about your situation, I think you're just going to get vilified, and that's what happened here. They didn't come out, and they weren't honest about the situation, and they got vilified. It's unfortunate, but I think people have to plan for that and understand that, hey, if anything happens, we're going to share as much information as we can with as many people as we can to try to protect the community. But a lot of people don't have those thoughts. That's kind of what I.
One of the things that gets me fired up about this, even if you just look at like what was trying to be covered up, right? Like the spillage from the H1 database of all these, contractors, I guess you couldn't call them employees, but all these drivers for Uber. It's just one piece of the PII that gets spilled out. But trying to say that the thing you're going to have bug crowd or bug bounty, Mario, I forget the name of the service. You're just focusing on that part and not about all the other systems that the attackers got access to that we all got to read about, like when they got on the file server, when they found the password file, when they gained access to the password vault. I mean, these are all things that have far greater reachings than just maybe they were able to dump some things from an insecure form on a web application that contained a bunch of PII. And so I think that it's not just for me, it's not just, we're trying to make this incident not wind up in the public domain, but it's also we're trying to downplay where our systems and security failed in this incident. And I think that doesn't help the community. That doesn't help people learn, what should I take away from this? Is the takeaway that there's a chance that we all could have never found out about it? Or is the takeaway that maybe I shouldn't store passwords and access to a password vault in plain text somewhere? And I think this kind of gets lost in the noise when you think about as Mario so eloquently brought up, you think about, well, a CISO has to make a choice. Like, where do I take a stand? Do I take a stand ethically and morally around integrity as it relates to reporting, or do I take a stand, where I might be helping make a business decision? And I think this is the thing that brings up for me that changes the perception of what the role of a CISO is in my book. I think before this incident, I thought a lot and personally projected that this was like the highest point of integrity maintenance, because you kind of toe the line between what does your technology say versus what is actuality. Like you brought up, Charles, you can accept too much risk and people could blame you for accepting too much risk, but at least that's factual. It's to the point. You knew that you were saying, I'm not going to protect these things over there. It's too expensive or it doesn't make business sense, which is a little different than actively going, well, no, I don't know what happened over there.
I think you just nailed 2 points pretty succinctly, right? Like, Joe Sullivan not only failed his company in as a business leader in a fiduciary capacity, right? But he failed the rest of his executive management team by exercising poor ethics, right? And like, this is going to be a very controversial thing I've already caught a lot of fire on LinkedIn, and I've decided to stay out of a lot of these discussions now because so many people are, vehemently defending Joe at this point, saying that CISOs really shouldn't be held liable for this stuff because selfishly CISOs don't want to be held liable for these things, right? I actually think it's good for the industry. I think it'll get a lot of bad CISOs out of the industry. I think my opinion is in the minority here, but I actually think that Joe was a former attorney. He should have known better. He was also not qualified to be a CISO. So you also have him sort of acting in a sort of like as the CEO's puppet instead of protecting the business as the board and the shareholders would have expected him to. To me, I think that's less of a dereliction of duty and more into criminal negligence. I do believe he deserved to serve time. And a lot of people are saying, 3 months or 3 years.
3 years. Yeah,
not so bad. But if you actually follow the case, and there was a great talk presented by attorneys at Black Hat on this, the reason he actually isn't behind bars isn't because of a lack of criminality. One, the judge let him off easy, and that's specifically because of where the case was tried. If that same case had been tried, in say New York, he would have 100% definitely been serving time, right? But also, the attorneys for the prosecution really bungled the charges. Like one of the things they charged him with was like misprision of a felony, and like other attorneys had to look up this obscure criminal act, right? And it's just literally misprision of a felony means that you tried to deliberately conceal knowledge of a treasonous act or a felony, right? And it turns out the case law for even convicting someone like that and being able to prove that they were deliberately concealing something is so difficult that they had almost set themselves up to fail just to let Joe off easy because of where the case was being tried.
It's like a mini law lesson that we just got at the same time that we're talking about the case, Mario. You're talking about jurisdiction. We're talking about like what charges were brought up about and were they good enough. I think you have a little bit of background in here, Charles, if you want to weigh in at all.
Yeah, the case was interesting to me in a lot of ways, but I think it's reminiscent of why the SEC did what they did when they released the new rules around breach reporting. And so, which is interesting because I don't think the White House actually liked what SEC did, because they kind of threw a grenade right in the middle of what the White House was trying to push as cybersecurity regulatory harmony. And they released a paper on it. So the SEC kind of threw a grenade in that process a little bit. But I mean, CISOs, in this case, CISOs should be held accountable in the sense of, and I think a lot of folks don't want to tread that dangerous ground of, okay, if we hold CISOs liable for this, what else are we going to hold them liable for? If the IT folks didn't put a secure email gateway on the email, is that the CISO's fault, right? So I think that was a lot of the sentiment was, if not for this, what's next? What else are we going to be held liable for? But I agree with the decision that that the CISO should have been held liable at any point that you're trying to conceal an issue from anyone, whether it's the board, the public. SEC equals everyone's friend. Nice. I don't know if I totally agree with that one. But it's I think those are the reasons that folks need to be held liable. If you're attempting to conceal something, you're not being honest, you're not sharing information. The idea at this point is to try to, if you become a victim, and we're all at some point we're all a victim of some cyber event, whether we're staying up for 72 hours investigating it, or it's us that got hit. We're all victimized in some way. And so if your thought isn't, hey, how do I use this to protect the rest of the community? You're wrong. And they didn't have that thought. Their thought was save ourselves at all costs. And so the CISO should be held liable for it. And if the CISO had done jail time, then so be it.
And I'm with you, Charles. Right at the point where, and right, just to bring it back to something that Mario said earlier, and then maybe we can talk about the next breach buster. Mario's brought up this moment where we're choosing to direct the hackers through this bug bounty. For me, this is the moment where you've gone astray. Choosing to disclose, I understand there are nuances to this, and there are breaches that we can look at. I mean, we could go back and look at Target from some number of years ago, which was really controversial around timelines of disclosure. I mean, I understand some of these nuances where the business might need to accept some risk for a few days. I mean, and take on some legal risk for a few days to wait notice on things. I understand these nuances, but taking something that already happened and redirecting it to the bug bounty, that's what does it for me. That's my lesson learned. Don't do that. And I would say, and it looks like the Justice Department agrees, right? Someone getting handed even 3 years of probation. I mean, any sentencing at all would be, kind of saying that the system agrees with that consensus and that opinion. Now, the other thing I wanted to bring up though is we've seemed to have quite a few legal experts aspiring to be in our chat. Is it also brings up this shift that you see of companies maybe not wanting to go public. Right? Is all these things that the SEC is going to levy onto a public company, are they actually going to just distract and dissuade people from taking their companies public? I think that's a really interesting angle that you could take downstream of more disclosure guidelines or more restrictions on cyber incidents. Does it protect your brand better to not be a public company? I don't necessarily think we need to get into that, but just curious if you guys have any high level thoughts on that.
Well, I agree with what Ray said in the chat. It is easy to look back and Monday morning quarterback, and I hate doing that. I agree, but don't. My advice: don't lie. Don't try to cover something up. It's going to get out. Get help from the government. Get help from the FBI. I mean, multiple FBI offices and FBI headquarters more than willing to help. The government, in a lot of cases, the government will help, and including CISA, and that's, even if it's just working with regulators to sort out how things are going to get reported or what things get reported. And in some cases, the government can delay reporting requirements just by the fact that you're working with them. And it depends on, and for the SEC, there's a clause in there that says if there's a national security implication that you may delay reporting, but you have to work with the FBI and the Department of Justice in order for that to happen. So you can always get help. So, but yeah, my advice: don't lie, don't try to cover anything up. And Mario's comments are spot on. That he should have been held accountable.
And Mario, any closing thoughts before we talk about our next breach buster?
Yeah, no, you hit the nail on the head. As soon as they made the decision to try and quietly pay them off through the bug bounty program, they began acting in a criminal manner. It's a bad look for the industry, and certainly not the sort of reputation we want to promote as being ethical CISOs.
Now, you bring up something. Go ahead, Charles.
No, the attackers did find a bug. I mean,
more than one, arguably.
They certainly found a bug, but
yeah,
I agree with Mario. Probably not the way to handle.
So, Mario, you said something there that I really liked, which is it brings up this view of CISOs. As we move on to our next breach buster, and Charles, maybe you could give us your thoughts on this one first. When we talk about the Sony breach, which is, I think everyone instantly can think of like remembering some impact that they had, or how, I mean, I even remember stuff that was in the news completely unrelated to cyber, like the terrorist type threats that were coming. As this, I don't know what else I would call it, Charles, but like there were real security concerns, like national security concerns, separate from the breach itself. But why why does this get the designation of a breach buster or a big breach, Charles?
I think you hit the nail right on the head, Matt. And I think that was, you know, to a lot of people, the Sony breach, it was just another company that had gotten attacked, right? But that was actually a landmark case in the sense of it had national security implications, and the reasons for the attack weren't because they found a vulnerability. It was a target of opportunity. They were targeted specifically because of the movie The Interview, and the North Koreans did not want that movie released, and to include requesting that the president squash the movie. And so, but now you have North Koreans, North Korean actors affecting. It became a civil rights issue. It became a freedom of speech issue. It became another country is trying to oppress our country because of freedom of speech, right? And there were a ton of national security implications as far as how do we respond to this as a country? What consequences are we going to enact upon a nation state who affected a cyber attack on a corporation for making a movie, right? For trying to inhibit free speech. And so, and I remember, that when I was at the FBI, that was, I was coordinating a lot of the analysis and reporting for the Sony incident, and our St. Louis and Los Angeles offices were deeply embedded with Sony, doing everything they can to help them. In fact, we deployed victim witness assistance folks out to help Sony employees. But you're right, there were also other implications to the Sony breach. It wasn't just that emails were stolen, people were embarrassed, which was a huge part of it, right? You're releasing private emails that were never meant to be posted in the public view, and some of them were, demeaning to either actors or directors and different folks. And so you've got an embarrassment issue. So you've got some emotional effects. You've got the employees who don't know what's happening. The North Koreans also sent emails, threatening emails that they were going to blow. They know where your kids go to school, and they're going to blow up the school. So they made threats that, and obviously the employees at Sony don't know that it's the North Koreans, right? And it's don't know that, okay, that's not very likely to happen. So you had employees pulling their kids out of school and saying there's a bomb threat. So now the school has to okay, do we evacuate? Like, what's happening? So there's a lot of chaos and confusion during some of these incidents, and Sony was one of those issues where it bled over from the cyber realm to the physical realm, just affecting employees' emotional states, wondering if the actors can carry out their threats, and threatening children. So the national security implications of that case were far-reaching. It wasn't just how are we going to respond. It affected Sony employees in a way that previous cyber events had not. Not unreminiscent of the Sands Casino. This was obviously politically motivated. So you had a politically motivated attack. So you've got geopolitical concerns. And the same thing happened to Sands Casino, right? When the CEO made pro-Israeli remarks, and so that drew the ire of Iran. And so again, it wasn't strictly it wasn't our target of opportunity. These were politically motivated attacks that carried a specific message, and our responses are often classified, right? The operations that happen after that, and in fact, Obama said, there will be a consequence, and it will be a time and a place of our choosing, but there will be a consequence. So we in the community were very uplifted that there was going to be some type of consequence to that action. Now, whether it was enough, sometimes it's remain to be seen. But these attacks also don't happen often on the politically motivated side because there is a cost to conducting the operation.
I think for me, the most interesting piece about the Sony breach isn't even the breach itself. It was what happened leading up to it. And I think it draws a great corollary from our previous breach discussion at Uber, where, it really boils down to poor information security leadership at Sony, right? Right before the breach, their director of information security, his name was Jason Spaltro, was having a SOX audit, and the SOX auditors said, "Hey, you don't have complex passwords, you don't encrypt your data, you don't use MFA. If you were a bank right now, you'd be out of business." And his response was like, "I'm not spending $10 million to prevent a $1 million breach," right? Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. We're not going to. That's a business decision. Sure, that statement by itself kind of makes sense, I guess. It exercises some poor ethics and poor judgment on behalf of your users and your clientele. But debatable, right? But if he had actually implemented just some basic cyber hygiene, he could have actually prevented the breach. And the what came out of the breach was, leaked movies, leaked internal memos, all sorts of really brand damaging, business damaging information out of Sony, where literally all of that could have been avoided by, and I hate to say it, following his audit findings. Now, the audit findings are never the end all be all in information security, but these were some pretty basic things where if he had been slightly less arrogant and slightly more ethical, this would have never happened.
One thing that neither of you mentioned, and maybe it's because it wasn't as big of an impact to you as it was to me, but people were getting access to the Game of Thrones season 7 early as a part of these leaks. And I personally refused to watch it. I wanted to wait until it aired on HBO. But then all the reviews came out about how the cast and the actors went in a different. I know I'm off topic, but I'm just really surprised that neither of the two of you mentioned that. Now, the question that it begs for me though is, I felt like at the time, and I don't know, was this 10, maybe even more than 10 years ago, Charles, 13 years ago? I don't even remember when the Sony breach was. I thought there was a chance that we were even going to go to war over this, that there was so much threats coming. And every time you opened the newspaper or any website, I mean, every single major news outlet, is North Korea going to attack over this breach because we released this movie, which for me was I just couldn't even imagine what it was like to live in a place where you couldn't watch a movie, right? Where a movie alone would be the difference between us having a peaceful state or not. And I think it just brings to light a different meaning to APT, right? We thought about APTs before as they're going to get in, they're going to steal data. They're going to, establish some kind of persistency that they're going to need lots and lots of experts and help from the feds to be able to get them out of your environment. Well, now you're dealing with kinetic threats from an APT. You're dealing with physical security issues outside of the cyber world. And I think we've seen, breaches move in that direction when we also look at stuff I think back to the Eastern European or Russian cyber criminals that got into the water system in Oldsmar, Florida. I think of when the pipelines get hit. These are things that are crossing from the cyber domain into the physical domain. And Sony was the one that shined the light on that, at least for me.
Yeah, that's interesting because what I've always told folks is there's always an analytical side to obviously the APT type attacks, right? So, and I've always said that how a country behaves every day is how they're going to behave in cyber. We tend to not think about socioeconomic or geopolitical reasons for APT actors getting involved with things, but we think about China and Russia, we think about intellectual property theft, and we think of a lot of APT actors are low and slow because they're trying to steal information. In a lot of cases, that's true. In most cases, that's true, right? But this was interesting in the sense that North Korea likes to project power, and this was a chance for them to be able to project power. But they also need cyber operations to make money, right? After they hit Bangladesh Bank, and that they fund their government through illicit programs, and that's been nothing new, right? And so they're definitely going to mirror that ideology in cyber. But the one thing that was disappointing, I thought, that Obama had come out initially and said, we consider this an act of vandalism. And so that was a bit disheartening in the sense that we should have drawn a line in the sand immediately and said, you will not do this, and immediately affected an operation to impact. Now, there's a whole bunch of things that happen on the classified side, obviously, when you're conducting operations that aren't going to be made public. But nothing, like, if it's not visible to the public and if it's not visible to your adversary, did you impose a cost? And so, I think that that the geopolitical concern there was, we should not have said it was an act of vandalism. But I think saying it was an act of war is probably too far, right?
Too aggressive. If they had carried out some kind of physical thing, I think yes. Just the cyber attack alone, yeah, I don't. Vandalism is too weak, but war is too strong.
Right.
Somewhere in the middle.
And I think they decided, the president's staff decided, okay, let's de-escalate this, and let's not call this an act of war. And should it have been an act of war? No, not necessarily. But we should have, I think, done more on the foreign policy side to draw a line in the sand to say, you're not going to do this. You are not going to do this to our country.
I might even remember the president during that time frame say that an attack on an American company is an attack on America.
Yeah.
Now, they might not have followed through with that in action, but they at least gave a very compelling speech to me saying, right, that was an attack on America.
Yeah.
Now,
no.
One of the things that keeps coming up while we've been talking about this, Charles, and I'm going to pose this question to you. There's some people in the chat that think that there is a trust that needs to be repaired between public and private sector. A lot of people are commenting on, yes, share with the FBI, but also, should we? And for me, it's a no-brainer. I think it is for you too, but maybe you could tell us, like, either, why do you think some people are speculating that, why not trust the FBI and bring them in? Like, what are their motivations, and how do you think we can repair or fix that? Because ultimately, in my view, at least, working together, like, bringing in law enforcement to help them fight cybercrime kind of makes sense. But curious what your thoughts are here.
So that's an interesting one too. It's there's the joke. We're the government. We're here to help. I mean, if you look at from a different perspective, that the FBI is trying to any cyber attack. Typically, you're committing a crime / felony, and most of these are felonies, right? Any violation of 1030 USC 1030 is probably going to be a felony, right? So, the FBI is charged with investigating those now, and the FBI specializes in victim assistance, and so, and you can get resources and help through victim assistance programs, and so that's one benefit, right? And because you're a victim, the FBI is going to try very hard to make sure you don't get re-victimized by, government bureaucracy. And again, it doesn't always work because regulators don't work for the FBI. But in a lot of cases, while the FBI is conducting an investigation, they can calm regulators down, and share some information with the regulators to calm them down before they start coming at you. And so, and again, with the SEC thing, DOJ can delay your reporting of an event if there's a national security implication. So, there are benefits to immediately bringing in the FBI and law enforcement. And for whatever reason, if you like, the FBI recommends that you don't pay a ransom, but for some reason, if you have to, they will help you do that so that you don't get victimized in the payment process as well. So a lot of actors will try to victimize you during the payment process if they don't get what they want. And so the FBI, especially the folks on the cyber criminal side, can help you work through those issues. If that makes sense. It's not and they don't always share information back. And I think that's what a lot of people don't like is, and now that I'm on the other side, I understand why. But I always said, FBI not sharing information with you since 1908. Like I felt like that was our motto because we couldn't always share information back, especially if we got that information from sources. You have to protect sources. And so, and that means there's many times where you can't share information because people's lives can be in jeopardy, especially if you have sources that are giving you information.
And I think, one other thing that came up, and Mario, maybe you've got a good tip here on this, or I'll throw this one at you first, is someone saying, I want to read about these big breaches. Is there a resource that you guys jump to find and read about these big incidents? I'll throw it at both of you guys, and then I have an answer that probably everyone will guess. So where do you go to read about this stuff, Mario?
Hacker Twitter, or X now. If you're not following, half a dozen Russian APT groups, half a dozen researchers, and the rest of Hacker Twitter, you're going to be missing out on a lot. It's typically where everything breaks first.
Okay. What about you, Charles? That's a good one.
Yeah, no, X, Twitter /X is definitely a good resource. And someone posted VX Underground. That's definitely a good one. Now after the fact, I'm always partial to Darknet Diaries, but always lots of great information you can get there too. But I think the more public ones are probably the best. But I can't wait to hear yours, Matt.
Oh, I'm really partial to the Varonis blog. So Varonis Threat Labs always has something to say about a lot of the big breaches and incidents. If one of our moderators even could drop in a link to Black Cat and Alpha V, Devere Saison, he heads up our security research team, Varonis Threat Labs. He joins me on State of Cybercrime sometime. And I also have like a personal intel feed from Devere. So I'm really biased, but I think our audience might have guessed that I was going to say that. Now, we did have a couple of other things other than these breach busters that we wanted to go through today. One of those, it was predictions. So, what do we think the blockbuster breaches or the breach busters of tomorrow are going to look like? And either one of you guys that wants to go first.
Prognosticating is not exactly my specialty, but
I hate predicting.
Well, if you want to think about it for a second, I think you could throw it back to me, Charles. I believe in you.
So I think going forward, and maybe a little bit farther in the future, identity is going to be everything. And if you look at the way, lately, if you've tried to create a fake, even a fake Facebook account, they shut you down. You have to try to come in another way. So, and I think, them cracking down on that is good because obviously they're trying to fight disinformation in their own way. And so I think disinformation will continue and probably get worse. But I think identity is going to be where the war is going to be. And we're seeing that now. Even low-level fraud actors are impersonating our own employees, and trying to steal equipment.
Reroute paychecks is one we investigate frequently, where someone will call in to a financial institution or an employer and say, "I'm Charles. My information is blank. Please change my direct deposit." I mean, these types of things, these low-level fraud cases. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's so I think we're starting to see that now, but as actors start to put more analytical resources behind how to impersonate others, I think that's where the next battleground is going to be, is identity.
100%. Everything I say after this is probably going to be wrong. But if I had to guess, if I look at the motivations and the levers the attackers use for their motivations, right? Attackers need, current attackers, the current threat landscape is monetarily driven. Ransomware has moved to ransomware and extortion. Extortion is just another lever they're pushing to extract payment. Sometimes they lay low and they hijack wire transfers, right? Like that's another lever they use for extracting payment. What's next? I'm not going to say this is 10 years away. I'll stay short term, because I think it's impossible to predict 10 years out in cyber. Three years, I think, is a more realistic time horizon. But what am I looking at now from a business technology change standpoint that the attackers can leverage as their new lever for monetary extraction for causing these breaches? It's been almost a year now where every business is talking about how to leverage Chat GPT, or what they're calling AI, that the rest of us know is just regular machine learning, right? I think the business-driven need to be competitive in the market landscape is going to cause this rapid over-adoption of, quote, AI systems, right? And I think you're going to see attackers, you already see attackers abusing just Chat GPT for fun and games right now. But once, these companies have, their data attached to, AI, there's going to be a whole new class of attacks, no different than like when SQL injection first showed up on the scene. We were able to dump the databases. The Chat GPTs of the world, the AIs of the world, are just going to be another API for accessing the data. And they're just going to talk these systems into handing over the data and getting around all the other security defenses that we've put up, right? They're also going to have other classes of attacks. Like we already know about data poisoning. AI data poisoning will probably be another attack venue they're going to leverage to pull data back. They're also going to find ways to talk the AIs into executing commands for them, doing command execution and giving them shells inside the network, right? Like it's the same classes of attack that we've always dealt with: command injection, database exfiltration, etc. But it's just a new API for talking to the data. So I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the coming years.
Varonis just did a whole piece on how you could use Cortana in that way. That you could ask Cortana for all the PII, and it'll dump it into a really nice formatted spreadsheet for you to exfiltrate. So it does your job of doing the data recon part for those that follow the MITRE attack framework. It does it for you. Now, just to tie these two together, and then we'll move on to our next one, and to get you guys prepared for that, we want to give some people some tips on responding to an incident next, and really tie those two together. One, I agree with you, Charles, on the identity side, but I think a lot of it's going to come from like the misuse and abuse of keys and secrets. So like we talked about in the Uber breach, if you've got places where you've got either plain text passwords or cloud secrets or cloud keys, and they're stored openly in an unprotected way, and attackers are going to find them and use those against you, I predict that's going to be a lot more of what we see, especially as organizations get into this hybrid cloud area. But that same thing could be said about like using a technology like an Okta or an Entra AD, where you have this federated identity. You're going to get lateral, I call it lateral movement in a bag. right? The attacker can reach in and laterally move anywhere that user has access to because of how easy we've made it to have a single sign-on experience between multiple different applications. So this ability to kind of move between apps is only going to get easier. And Charles, this reinforces your point and ties it back to identity. And if AI only makes the attacker's job even easier, then we're going to get to this point where the attacker's finding what they're looking for and exfiltrating it is going to become trivial. And it's going to really, I think, undermine the need for data protection. Now, we've got about 10 minutes left, and we've been covering all the questions that have come in so far. If you're an audience member and you have a burning question, throw it into the Q&A now, and we might have time just to cover one or two more. But what I wanted to close with is, I think we've all had experience, investigating, helping others, advising others, maybe even handling them ourselves, cyber incidents. What tips do you have for someone to be prepared for a cyber incident?
Well, first, I hate giving general advice because obviously everyone's security program should be couture, custom to their threat model and their business vertical, etc. But in general, how to be prepared for a breach. Practice makes perfect, right? You do your tabletops, you exercise your IR plans, you run your red team exercises, your purple team exercises. That's the general diet and exercise regimen for getting ready for a breach. I get more excited about doing all the stuff to prevent a breach, but it's important to practice your IRP and make sure that everyone knows their role. I've actually found that many members, even though they might be documented in your IRP of like your executive team, specifically legal, really aren't aware of how crucial of a role they play in an actual incident. So the tabletops have actually been really excellent for having other executives get more practice, because it really doesn't matter how good your information security team, your threat hunters are. If you're in a real situation, oftentimes it's the members outside of information security that can be blockers if they're not well practiced. So having the organization as a whole practiced is crucial. I couldn't recommend that enough.
Yeah, I think that's spot on. Always try to practice practice through your IR plan with TTXs and invite corporate comms and legal. Everyone's busy, and so sometimes those groups are resistant to kind of things. But relationships are probably one of the most important things that you can have before an incident happens, and that's make sure you have relationships with your local FBI office. Make sure you have relationships with CISA and other organizations where if you do need help, you've got the relationships established to do it. Obviously having an IR plan, it's important, and it's important to exercise it, but it's also important to realize that whatever plan you come up with, some adversary is going to defeat it, and you're going to have to work around it and figure out, and that happens in the military too, right? There's a difference between deliberate long-term planning and crisis action planning, and you try to plan long-term for an incident. You're still doing a little bit of prognostication, but realize that planning for events that you don't expect is just as important as planning for things that you do expect. And having those relationships gets those other folks involved from corporate comms and legal, and establishing those relationships inside the government and inside your own organization is super important. And I think one of the things that people don't realize is that if you don't have those relationships established and a crisis happens, that's not the time to try to find someone to help. That's not, make sure that you've got consultants ready at your disposal from, a wide variety of sources. Also, I would say threat intelligence is extremely important. Knowing and prioritizing threat actors that might come after you and your data is important. So assessing, what you do and how you do every day, what adversaries want that or would want to impact that is important. And so having an established threat intelligence program helps that significantly when you're preparing for an incident.
If I could echo that sentiment and even expand on it a little bit, I got a really good set on this panel with some members of Marsh McLennan, their insurance brokerage. They advise a lot of companies and help direct them and have to ultimately help with their insurers to provide payments for things. There's often pre-negotiated rates with IR and forensics firms. There's breach counsel that you need to establish a relationship with, where it's very advantageous for you to have that relationship with breach counsel before the incident happens. And so there's a lot of these, what you might consider to be procedural and non-technical things that are of great value to you. And I would echo that sentiment, and I would say, and balance those with the practical exercises. So many times when I speak on a panel at a conference or something, I'll ask how many people have actually gone through a real breach or a real incident. And you would think that the answer is going to be a lot more of the people in the room, but that's actually a really concentrated thing in our industry, because a lot of the IR professionals work at IR firms. And then the big companies where these incidents happen and they're large and publicized, you don't hear about them as often as the kind of everyday user compromises that happen. And so have your experts on standby. And the other two tips I would give you is, one, practice containment and eradication, as that's the one thing that I see organizations really struggle with. Is they've always thought about how they're going to detect something, and they've always thought, okay, and this is how I'm going to restore my systems after all the bad things happen. But they don't think about, how am I going to get these bad people off my network? One super basic example, we'll get a little technical with everybody, if that's okay. Have reset your KRB, TGT, your Kerberos service account. Reset that at least once, because you're going to need to do it twice in the event of an incident in order to get rid of what we would call a golden ticket. But if you've never done it before, it's going to have impact. It's going to create, quote, havoc in IT. People are going to get disconnected to things. Systems aren't going to talk to each other anymore, but it's definitely something you're going to have to be able to do. And the last one I would give is be empathetic. I've seen people get really hot in incidents and angry and frustrated, and people are kind of taking things out on each other. Things get very emotional. As a security practitioner, be that calm, cool, and empathetic person. Realize that people have probably never gone through this before. Try to help them navigate it. Try to keep everybody from getting hot or angry about everything, because it's really easy to just jump to blaming and finger pointing. Like, it's that Mario guy's fault. He didn't apply that patch, or he didn't get that MFA like that auditor said. It's all because of Mario. I'm done working. I'm just going to be angry at Mario for the next week. Don't do stuff like that.
And that's funny, because that's I always tell my folks and others that during an incident, if you're tasked with responding to and investigating incidents, if you lose your cool, you've given permission to everyone else to lose their cool. And I think that's probably one of the most unspoken things, is don't overreact in these incidents. And I think fear tends to allow people to overreact. But and whether it's a cyber incident or an active shooter or any other type of incident, maintaining calm and composure is probably your best ally in the middle of a crisis. And so overreacting can be just as bad as underreacting. So, and I don't think people tend to realize that, but yeah, that's spot on.
One last question we got in the chat, and I'll take a shot at this one first. How do we convince management that breach counsel is important? Thanks for that question. Let your insurance company do it. I'm sure your company has cyber insurance or is thinking about it. Ask them what they recommend you do. And I'm sure in that list that insurance broker or insurance company is going to give you is going to include these things. Let them speak. Let them do that convincing for you if you've been having a hard time doing it yourself. Anyone that you would want to add, Charles or Mario?
What was the question?
Yeah, just from one of our audience members. How do I convince my management having breach counsel is important?
Okay. So the answer is it's going to depend. The how is always going to depend, but it never hurts to put them through an exercise where they they come to the conclusion themselves. So they so they come up with it like it's almost like their own idea. Give them a tabletop where this becomes a crucial component they're missing, and then they're just gonna tell you to go get it.
That's a good angle. Make it their idea.
Only
Yeah. No, that's that's a good one. I would go one step further than that and say you need to make sure that you're hiring the right outside counsel, especially for folks that if you just hire a firm who does general practitioner stuff and doesn't really specialize in cyber breaches or intrusions, you may end up not being as well off. So always do research on which outside counsels, and that again, that's relationships, right? Establish those relationships beforehand and convince, and that gives you time to convince your management folks to be able to have on retainer an outside counsel who actually specializes in cyber breaches. I've worked with, we have hundreds of vendors, and many of them have been impacted by ransomware, and we have to help them investigate that. And I typically know right off the bat if that organization is going to handle it well or not, depending on which outside counsel they're using. So, or if they even get an outside counsel. So if we're working with a vendor and they have a breach, and I ask them, hey, who's your outside counsel? And they're like, we don't have one. I know we've got our work cut out for us. So, so that's, but I think I think social engineering your management to understand that you need that before a crisis happens is important too.
Well, guys, I think that brings us to the end of time. I see that Ashley's got her hand up. Two things I want to do before we close out. One, I'd like to ask the audience to join me in thanking Mario and Charles for like all the expertise and knowledge that they brought to us today. I personally really, really, really appreciate it. And I know our audience members do too. Secondly, I want to thank everyone who's watching, our audience. These Data First forums, all of these web events that we host are made possible because of you, our audience. And so we appreciate the opportunity, the privilege to get to speak with you and address you. And so I really, really, really appreciate you guys joining, and hope you join us on the next Data First forum. And Ashley, I will pass it back to you.
You took all the words right out of my mouth, but thank you everyone for joining us. And Mario and Charles, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your perspective. Matt, excellent job as always. If you want to check out some past episodes of the Data First Forum, you can visit the link on your screen. And we hope to see you next time.